XY pads, incredibly useful, incredibly fun to work with, but a little bit of a finicky thing to set up. Recently I released Ambedo, a cinematic string synth library that actually uses an XY pad. So I'm going to use that to show you how to put one together. Let's dive in and check out the code in Kontakt. Hey, my name is Steve, composer, engineer, and lecturer, and welcome back to the channel. This video is part 1 of 2 because XY pads is quite a big topic. It took me a little while to figure them out myself. X and Y controls are sort of like 2 sliders in one because you've got the X left and right control that's assigned to something, and the Y top to bottom control that is assigned to something as well. So it's almost like having 2 sliders in one. It can create a really fluid way of moving between different sounds and finding intricate balances between the two of them that you wouldn't have necessarily found if you actually had 2 knobs or sliders. So it's a really fun thing to do, and it's really cool to finally get to release a library with this. If you haven't seen already, I released Ambedo, which is a fantastic cinematic string synth inspired library. It takes a couple of custom patches from some synths that I have, and it's 70s inspired string synth sound. It's something I really love. I love layering it in as texture to my tracks, and it's just something I wanted to share with you. So you can download that for free from pianobook.co.uk. Check out the link in the description below. Because that library has an XY pad and one that I'm really happy with, I want to be able to show you how I actually created that across these 2 videos. Now we're going to be diving into some pretty serious coding stuff, so I'm going to make a couple of assumptions. One, I'm going to assume you've probably made your own instrument and that's why you're here. You may be familiar with some basic Kontakt skills, you may have even seen my tutorial series. Now if that doesn't sound like you and it's not something that you've done yet and you haven't quite got into scripting your own GUI interface, don't panic. This channel in particular is going to be great for you. Check above or in the description below for a link to my Kontakt free tutorial series. It's a 3-chapter series, 16 videos spanning everything you want for building your first instrument. How to sample things, how to put those samples into Kontakt and build your library, and then how to script a basic interface for you as well. So if you're unfamiliar with the scripting language and how to get some basic controls up and going and how to get the standard performance view up and going and all that sort of stuff, check out that course. It's going to be wonderful. The other thing I'm going to assume is that you're probably familiar with how to get custom graphics into your interface as well, because we're going to be using some of those today. Again, if you haven't, there is a free course on this channel for you. Check above or in the description below for links to the free custom Kontakt graphics tutorial. It's a 3-part video that walks you through one of my libraries and how I got those graphics across. There's a few little things to bear in mind in that process, and it's not as straightforward as just importing a picture. So do check out that course if you're unfamiliar. But otherwise today we're going to dive into XY pads. Now before we dive into the script, let me just quickly show you what Ambedo does. Here is Ambedo, and just straight out of the box this is what it sort of sounds like. It's a really gorgeous sound, and built straight into this XY pad on the Y controls at top to bottom is a blend between the 2 string synths. So that's those 2 different analog synths being melded together at the top, or just the one by itself alone at the bottom. What makes this library really cool though, and what I'm kind of really proud about myself, is how I developed this side panel here for all the effects. Over here on the right, you can turn on any of these effects, and then you can assign the control to either the X or the Y parameter. So either the X left to right or the Y top to bottom. So for instance, let's turn reverb on and leave it on the X. So it's going to send the reverb from left to right here. And we could turn on the filter, but set this one to Y. So the cutoff is going to be controlled along the Y axis. So as I move up, it's going to open the low pass filter. And as I move to the right, it's going to drench it in reverb. Let's have a listen. Now, let's dive in and start coding. That is what this is all about. Now, normally what we would do is we would come into the spanner and we would jump into the script editor and see our script there. We can already see some controls turning up. And as I scroll down, because this is all my performance view, here is my actual script editor below. Now, normally I just edit script straight into here. It can be a bit finicky though, and a little bit hard to see. So what I've done is I've just copied all of this across to here so that we can see it in bigger format. This is exactly the same script. I'm not using brackets, this program, to control or write any script. I'm just using it now for demonstration, just so it's a bit easier for you guys to see. Now, as I scroll down, you can see that I've got lots of comments in here and indentations and stuff. And that's all designed purely to make it easier to read, easier to debug later on and know what it was that I was doing in the first place. I highly recommend that. It is really useful because when you're going back to do something later on, you have no idea what you might have done or why you were doing things. And you basically got to decode your own code and then go ahead and debug it if you're in there to fix an issue, for example. Now, as I scroll down, I will be going past all these different switches and knobs and sliders and stuff, and I eventually get to the section that we are interested in today. Now, it's worth noting that all of this is for the XY pad. All of this code is for the XY pad, which is comparatively more code than you would get for a single button up here. But all of this is inside the onInit control. The onInit block is the first block that declares and calls back all of this script when the instrument is initialized. So basically when it's turned on for the first time or opened for the first time. There are some basic script elements, so you've got to make the performance view, you've got to set the title, the height, the width, and the background all here at the top. Then you can start declaring your controls, which is what I've done as I go down through this section. Once you've declared those basic sort of controls for performance view, then you'll be ready to start diving into this XY pad control. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk through the code and tell you what my code is doing specifically. But it's worth noting that all of this is in the KSP manual. That manual should be living on your computer somewhere. It is so important when coding, because you can look up things really quickly and really easily. I have it behind me here, for example. This UI_XY is going to be the variable that we're declaring, and it's got all of the code with annotations on what it's doing, ready for you to dive into and have a look and see how it's created. So none of this that I'm going to show you in my instrument is any different really from what's in the KSP article. Hopefully I'll just be able to make a little bit more sense of it, particularly if this is your first time. However, dive into that KSP manual to look up any of the details and also specific parameters for specific commands. They're all in there and you can see how you should be laying them out. Okay, so let's dive into the code. So the first thing here is I've got a block of 3 lines, and this is all to declare my XY pad. So I've just written declare, and I've got UI_XY, and I've set a name for it and a few details here. Now, if you've seen coding before, or you've seen any of my videos or tutorials, you'll know that usually I use the dollar symbol, and that dollar symbol stands for an integer variable, a variable that contains an integer number that can be varied up and down. You may have also seen me use a percentage sign. That percentage sign is talking about an integer array. An array is just a collection of integer variables. For instance, an array of 4 numbers, and those numbers could be 0, 1, 2, and 3. And those 4 numbers sit and live in an array. However, if it isn't an integer number that we're dealing with, but a real number, as in a number that could be something between integer values, then we use a different symbol. That's what's happening here, is we're using the question mark, which indicates an array, but it's a real array or a real number array. That's why we got the question mark XY. And the XY is just simply whatever I named it. That could be whatever you want to name it, but I just kept it nice and simple. Keep your variable names brief, because you could be typing them quite a bit. So a real number is something that can be more than just whole numbers. 1 is an integer. The next integer above that is 2, but 1.5, that's a real number. So if you have a variable or a control that has to use real numbers, you need to be using a real type of declared variable. So in this case, a real array is a question mark. It's going to make a little more sense why it's a real number as we move through this code, but basically the XY pad uses real numbers, which means it can return values of point something. Because of that, we're using real numbers. Now, one thing that's a little bit different about this block of text is this square brackets 2. Up here, this square brackets 2 next to the XY section is talking about the cursor. And that's because XY pads can have more than one cursor. More than one cursor seems a bit strange, but what it allows you to do is use multiple cursors on the one XY pad and then control any one of them. So you could have 4 cursors and they control a different thing each for X and Y. At the moment, if we look at Ambedo, I've just got the one cursor. So I've got the number 2 in there purely because that is counting for 2 different controls, the X and the Y. If I had 2 cursors in here, I would have number 4 here, because that would be 4 parameters, the X and Y on the first cursor and the X and Y on the second cursor. So you could basically have 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on up to 32, because you are allowed 16 cursors on one X and Y pad control, which is pretty cool. You might not understand why you would need that to begin with, but there are some libraries out there that make use of that, and it's definitely really something cool. I'm actually working on one soon, so subscribe and stay connected, because you'll be able to actually get that one for free too. Now the second and third lines there are my standard sort of declare a random integer variable. This is in this case xy_id, and just set it to the basic function of get UIID for my pad. So I want to get the UIID of my control pad, my XY pad, and then I can just use this variable anytime I want this code. It's a little bit of code writing now to save code writing later, essentially. You can even see through a lot of my code, this XYID variable is coming up everywhere, all through here, a whole lot. So it's really time saving rather than typing out this huge piece every single time. Okay, my next set of controls is basically talking about the pictures. Again, check the description below for Kontakt custom graphics tutorial if you haven't done that before. But if we click over here in Ambedo, you can see that this control surface, the whole thing looks very unique to me and what I've done. And the XY pad is no different. This is not the standard look of an XY pad, which is just usually a gray box. I've skinned it, or I've created a graphic for it and placed that in, and I have to declare that using code. The same is the case for this cursor. This cursor here is a different type of cursor to the standard diamond shape that it normally is. So what I've done is I've used 2 lines of script here, and I created in the background my custom graphics, and I used my custom graphics, attaching them to this XY pad. So one thing to note there about the custom graphics is that the background of the XY pad is just like the background of the instrument. It's static with no animations. And the cursor is actually a little bit like a button. It has an on-off when clicked, and an on-off when hovered over. So you can see as I click on it, it actually turns a little bit lighter. So I've designed that with the custom graphic. So I've simply used set control par, and I'm using a string array. I'm using an array because we're dealing with an array element, and you can see array is being used quite a bit here. And I'm using control par string because I am putting in a string of characters or text. So the value it's expecting is a written text value, so a string of characters, not an integer whole value number. So simply in there, set control par string array, and it's the get ID version of my variable there, but control par picture being my background picture, and then XY pad is what I called it. 0 is fine at the end for both of these, and I've just changed this one to control par cursor picture, specifically for the cursor image that I created. Now on to the next block. The next block is automation. Automation is where you can control the XY pad and the cursor that lives on it with automation in your DAW. Whether that DAW be Logic or Cubase or Ableton or Pro Tools or whatever. Every DAW pretty much has automation. If you want to see how Ambedo uses the automation and it in action, check the link above or in the description below for the Ambedo reveal video. That will show you what I mean by this. But if you're at this stage, you're probably aware of what automation does. So automation for the XY pad is actually 2 lanes of automation. One for the X control and one for the Y control. It's not just 1 lane of automation. So we have to kind of label both of those, create them, and then label them with names. So these first 2 lines are basically controlling the automation and creating the automation lanes. We're setting a control par array, and we're using the XYID, which is pretty standard. This time the control we're looking for, the parameter, is control par automation ID. And you can see here that these 2 sentences are basically the same, except that one ends in 0, and then one ends in 1, and then 1. So in that one, we're basically saying we're targeting the X control, the 0, and we're creating the first lane to that one. And then the next line, we're saying we're targeting the Y control, the 1, and creating the next line 1 to that one. So I would just say no matter the number of cursors that you have, you do 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, and so on, because that's just a really easy way of making sure everything's straight and ordered. Then below that is the set control par string array. It's a string because we're now setting the name of these controls. Now I just kept it simple with X pad control and Y pad control. And that's really because of the way that Ambedo works. Like the X control could be anything, the Y control could be anything, because we change the assign with all those switches, which is one of the best parts about Ambedo, one of the things I enjoyed creating the most and love the most about this library. So the X pad control, the Y pad control, those are just names that I've used, but you can get creative with them. If you have reverb assigned to the Y control, set the Y automation to reverb or reverb wet or whatever it is going to be. And then I'm just typing in 0 and 1 to set to the X and then the Y cursor. So the next 3 lines are basically all to do with the mouse behavior and mode. The first line is talking about mouse mode and the next 2 the behavior. Now there are basically 3 modes for our mouse, labeled as 0, 1 and 2 because of the 0-based counting style of Kontakt and scripting. Mode 0, or the first mode, is basically saying that when we click the cursor and drag, it'll move, but if we click anything else on that XY pad that isn't a cursor, it won't move. So that means when we look at Ambedo over here, if I was to click on this and move it, it will move, but if I clicked somewhere over here and moved on mouse mode 0, or the first mode, it wouldn't move this cursor at all. I've got it set to 1, as you can see in my script here. That means that if I click over here and drag, it moves the cursor with me. I thought this was a better playing style. I only have 1 cursor on there, so I didn't want them to have to worry too much about getting the mouse exactly right. I just wanted them to click and drag, and this made the most sense for me. The first mouse mode, or mouse mode 0, might make more sense if you got more than 1 cursor, because you don't want to drag all of them all at once. By clicking on just the 1 cursor and forcing that to be selected before it moves can help resolve that issue. So you can see why mouse modes exist. The third one is where it will actually snap to a value. So if you want to click over the top right here and have the mouse snap, you would need mouse mode 2, or the third mouse mode. Now the next 2 lines are talking about mouse behavior, and that you would have seen before if you've done anything with a knob or a slider. For instance, when you use UI_slider, it slides from left to right, but you often need to put the mouse behavior to -1000 so it starts sliding up and down. The mouse mode just basically changes the direction. So if you set it at the top 5000, it will move left to right very fast. If you do -5000, very fast again, but this time top to bottom. Any lower values than 5000 or more than -5000, as they start to come into the middle at 0, it slows the mouse behavior down. So you have to move the mouse further to move the control further along. Now in this case with the X and Y, we just need positive values, but basically we're saying somewhere between 0 and 5000 in order to make the mouse move at a certain speed. So if I click back over to Ambedo, you can see that as I click and drag this, it moves pretty in line with my mouse, like it's doing pretty well. That's because I got it set to 1000 and I tested it and made sure that that worked. So really this is just fine tuning to taste. Depends on the size of your XY pad, depends on the control that you want over it. Most of the time 1000 is a good amount. So again, this is a set control par, pop in the XY ID. This is the control parameter we're looking for, the mouse behavior X and mouse behavior Y, and just set to 1000 and see how it goes. All right, we're getting near the end of declaring our XY pad. If I just hit apply at this point, right, and just hit apply and Kontakt made the graphic, what would happen is, assuming you've already got your performance control set up, you would have an XY pad, it would slap it at the top left corner, it would be skinned with the cursor and background that you said, but the background might be a bit cut off or chopped depending on the size of the XY pad. The XY pad won't be in the right spot. That's where this control comes in. So now we're using set control par, and it's all about the position and the size of our XY pad. So here we've got the position for X and the position for Y. So this is both in pixels, and it's 340 pixels across and 332 down. So that's basically X being across from the left and Y being from the top down. And it's measured off this little corner here. So that's where it's been positioned. So it's bang in the middle there. Then the width and the height, of course, is to set the size of your XY pad. The last few controls are fairly straightforward. We're setting where on the X axis and where on the Y axis we should start. Now I've set both of these to 0. That means when I come over to Ambedo, it's here at the bottom left when it first starts up. And that suits me for this instrument because I don't want any control to be active at the time. The X and Y pad though is actually not measured like knobs. Knobs, for instance, are a number between 0 and 1 million. So they would be, a million points along here. The X pad is a little bit different than those knobs or sliders. It's a real number from 0 to 1. As we mentioned before, real numbers can include point values. 1.5 is a real number, but it's not an integer number, which is a whole value, which would be 1 or 2. 1.5 is in the middle, and that's a real number. In this case, 0 to 1 is the full range, and that could be anything in between. It could be 0.6259, for instance. That's a real number. It kind of sounds odd just saying real number because, I mean, all numbers are real in a way. But what I mean is basically Kontakt treats everything as either an integer whole value number, or if it's not, it's a real number. XY pads work in real numbers. And that's going to be important in part 2 of this video series, because when you come to script it, that causes a few issues when scripting the functionality into the XY pad. More on that in part 2. For now though, if for instance you wanted to set it in the middle of the XY pad, so you wanted to make sure that this cursor started right here in the middle, you would need to set both of these numbers to 0.5. So that's an example there. If you wanted it to be in the middle but only on the y-axis, then the y-axis, there's number 1 here, because x is first followed by y, it'll be 0.5. And this would stay as 0. So you can have a bit of control over where you want this to start. The final thing is make underscore persistent, which is the same on a lot of controls. We're just making sure that this control is always going to be recalled to where it was last left when you save the session and close it. That way, if you've been working in the DAW, you've been writing your track, and then you save and close and come back the next day, everything's going to be in the same spot that you left it. That's very important. Okay, so that's all the script. Now let's just quickly recap a few key details there to remember. The first thing is that XY pads are real numbers and real arrays. So they have the question mark sign there and then the name of your XY pad. That you have to declare the number of cursors you want. So that being 2, 4, 6, and 8, because every cursor has 2 numbers in the array. The X control is always before the Y control, so the X value is 0, the Y is 1. The next cursor's X value would be 2, and the Y value would be 3, and so on. So it's always X first followed by Y. All the controls in here are designed to then declare this XY pad, and in the next video, we will check out how to add some functionality to that. So there we have it. We've declared our first XY pad. Now, if you're interested and you want to, you can download Ambedo for free from pianobook.co.uk. Check out the link below, and you can dive in and see the script that I've used. So that way, if you want to copy and paste anything, by all means, be my guest. It's right there. In the next video, we will be back with this controller. I'm going to show you how the functionality is added to the XY pad, but then I'm going to share how I actually made this switchboard on the side so that you could assign any control you wanted to it. It's a pretty cool way, and something I was really excited with for this library. So check out that next video, subscribe so you don't miss it, and I will catch you in the next one.